The fog came in every morning like it was owed something, rolling thick across the mud flats of Port Hollow, Maine, wrapping skeletal ship masts in gray fingers that wouldn't let go. To anyone else passing the old coastal road, it was a graveyard, rusted hulls half buried in tide pools, forgotten vessels rotting into the salt marsh like bones picked clean by time. But to Thatcher Kane, the man locals whispered about when they thought he couldn't hear this wasteland of corroded iron and splintered wood, was the only place left where the ghost couldn't find him. He stood at the edge of the property line that morning, work gloves already stained with rust, watching the tide pull back to reveal another layer of decay. 32 years old, and he moved like a man twice that age. Not from injury, from weight. The kind that doesn't show on x-rays. The kind that sits in your chest at 3 in the morning and reminds you that some decisions echo louder than gunfire. Beside him, Ranger sat perfectly still. The 5-year-old German Shepherd, black and tan coat dulled by coastal wind, didn't fidget or whine or beg for attention, the way most dogs did. He watched, ears forward, eyes scanning the horizon with the same tactical awareness Thatcher had drilled into him during their years together in forward operating bases halfway around the world. The dog's stillness wasn't rest, it was readiness. And right now, those dark eyes were locked on something out in the graveyard, something Thatcher couldn't see yet. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Kandahar, since the blast that turned 12 seconds of bad intel into a crater in the earth and a name on a wall. Daniel Reeves, best friend, brother in every way that mattered. The man who had trusted Thatcher's call when the world was screaming static and confusion. It's clear. Those were the last words Thatcher had spoken into the radio before the IED turned the street into hell. 2 words that replayed every night when sleep finally came. 2 words that had driven him here to this forgotten stretch of Maine coastline, to an inheritance from a great uncle he'd barely known. A ship graveyard, 23 rotting vessels on 40 acres of tidal wasteland. The old man had left it to him with a handwritten note that said, "Own, maybe you'll find what you're looking for." Thatcher hadn't found anything except rust and silence, and some days that was enough. The trailer he lived in sat another 100 yards up the muddy access road, a faded silver rectangle that had been his great-uncle's home for the last decade of the man's life. Inside was a hot plate, a table made from reclaimed ship timber, and a single photograph pinned to the wall with a thumbtack. Daniel Reeves in full combat gear, grinning like he had just told the world's best joke. The photo was taken 2 hours before the mission, before Thatcher's call, before everything ended. Ranger's low growl pulled him back to the present. Not aggressive, purposeful. The dog had risen to his feet, muscles coiled beneath his coat, head tilted toward the cluster of ships nearest the water's edge. Thatcher followed his gaze. There, listing hard to port in a pool of brackish water, was the USS Wanderer, a World War II patrol boat maybe 60 feet long. Her hull so covered in rust and barnacles, she looked more geological formation than vessel. Her name was barely visible beneath layers of corrosion-painted letters faded to ghosts. The dog took 3 steps forward, stopped, looked back at Thatcher with an expression that was unmistakable to anyone who'd worked with military K9S. This wasn't curiosity. This was alert. Thatcher pulled his gloves tighter. "What is it, boy?" Ranger didn't answer. He just turned and started walking toward the Wanderer with the kind of deliberate purpose that had made Thatcher's pulse quicken despite himself. He'd seen that walk before. In Helmand Province, when the dog had led them to a weapons cache hidden beneath a false floor. In Mosul, when Ranger had frozen mid-step and refused to let the squad advance another foot, saving 6 lives from a tripwire they never would have spotted. The dog didn't just see the world, he read it. And right now he was reading something in that rusted wreck that Thatcher had walked past 100 times without noticing. They moved across the mud flats together, Thatcher's boots squelching in the gray silt. Ranger's paws silent despite his weight. The morning was still, no gulls, no wind, just the distant rhythm of waves against the barrier rocks and the metallic groan of ships settling deeper into their graves. When they reached the Wanderer, Ranger didn't hesitate. He circled to the starboard side to a section of hull plating near the waterline that hung at an odd angle, half detached from the frame. The dog stopped, sat, stared at the rusted metal with an intensity that raised the hair on the back of Thatcher's neck. "Show me." The command was quiet, but Ranger responded immediately. He approached the hull plate and began pawing at a specific spot. Not random scratching, precise, focused. The same motion over and over, targeting a dented section where the metal had buckled inward, creating a gap barely wide enough for a fist. Thatcher knelt in the mud. Up close, the damage looked different. Not random corrosion, deliberate modification. Someone had cut into this hull plate decades ago, then welded it shut with a technique that was meant to look like original construction. But time and salt water had exposed the truth. The seam was visible now, a thin line running along the edge of the dent, and when Thatcher pressed his hand against the metal, it shifted slightly. Whatever was behind this plate, it wasn't original to the ship. He went back to the trailer, returned with a crowbar, a hammer, and a headlamp. Ranger hadn't moved an inch. The dog sat like a sentinel, eyes fixed on that hull plate, as if expecting it to open on its own. Thatcher wedged the crowbar into the gap and started prying. The metal resisted. Decades of rust had fused the edges together, creating a seal stronger than the original welds. He worked methodically the way he'd been trained to approach unexploded ordnance. Steady pressure. No sudden movements. Respect for things that had been waiting in the dark. 15 minutes later, the plate gave way with a shriek of tortured steel. Behind it, nestled in a cavity that had been cut into the ship's inner structure, was a metal box. Not large, maybe the size of a car battery, but deliberately hidden, deliberately preserved. The box itself was made of stainless steel, welded shut at every seam with no visible markings or handles. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep this thing dry and intact, and they'd succeeded. When Thatcher pulled it free from its hiding place, the metal was cold and clean. No rust, no corrosion, just smooth steel that had been waiting in perfect darkness for longer than Thatcher had been alive. Ranger's tail moved once, a single deliberate wag that said, "I told you." Thatcher carried the box back to the trailer, set it on the reclaimed timber table beneath a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Ranger took up position by the door, watching with the same intensity he'd shown at the ship. Outside, the fog was starting to burn off, revealing the full scope of the graveyard in pale morning light. But Thatcher wasn't looking at the view. He was staring at this box, this impossible hidden thing that had been sealed into a ship's hull sometime in the last 80 years. Someone had wanted this preserved. Someone had wanted it found. Eventually, he fired up the angle grinder. The high-pitched scream of metal on metal filled the trailer, and for a moment, Thatcher was back in the workshop at Bagram, prepping gear for night missions, while Daniel argued with the supply sergeant about requisition forms. The memory hit so hard, he had to stop. Breathe. Count to 5 the way the VA therapist had taught him. Then he went back to work. The first weld broke, then the second, then the third. When the final seam split, Thatcher set down the grinder and pried open the lid with his hands. Inside, wrapped in heavy oilcloth that crumbled at his touch, were 2 items. A leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with faded gold lettering that read Captain's Log USS Wanderer, and beneath it a rolled bundle of technical drawings, yellowed with age but preserved in remarkable condition. Ship schematics, modification plans, diagrams so detailed they could only have been drawn by someone with intimate knowledge of naval engineering. Thatcher opened the journal. The first page was dated April 12, 1944. The handwriting was precise military, belonging to someone who'd been trained to document the truth no matter how ugly. He read the first entry standing at the table, one hand braced against the wood, the other holding pages that felt like they might disintegrate if he breathed wrong. April 12, 1944. We departed Portsmouth Naval Shipyard under sealed orders. Crew manifest 14 souls, including myself. Mission classification above top secret. Even the executive officer doesn't know our final destination. I was briefed by naval intelligence this morning. A German U-boat designated U-873 is attempting to flee to South America with stolen assets. Gold, art, documents. The kind of cargo that could fund resistance movements for decades if it reaches the wrong hands. Our orders are simple: intercept, board, scuttle. No survivors, no evidence. This mission doesn't exist. Thatcher turned the page. The entries continued in the same measured tone. Daily weather reports, navigation logs, crew morale assessments. But between the lines, something else emerged. Captain James Hartley was afraid. Not of the mission, of his own men. By the third week at sea, the entries became shorter, more cryptical, references to conversations overheard, supplies going missing. A growing sense that someone aboard the Wanderer was feeding information to an outside source. May 3rd, 1944. We made contact with U-873 off the coast of Iceland. The engagement lasted 17 minutes. We took heavy damage to the stern, but managed to force them to surface. Boarding party led by Lieutenant Reeves. Good man, steady under fire. They secured the cargo hold and confirmed the intelligence was accurate. More gold than any of us had ever seen. Enough to change the course of the war if it had reached its destination. But something's wrong, I can feel it. The way some of the crew looked at that cargo. The whispered conversations that stop when I enter the compartment. Someone on this ship made a deal before we ever left port. Someone told the Germans we were coming. That's the only explanation for how close they came to sinking us. We should have had the element of surprise. Instead, they were waiting, ready, almost like they knew. Thatcher stopped reading. His eyes locked on one word in that entry, one name that made his chest tighten and his hands go numb. Lieutenant Reeves. He flipped through the journal faster now, looking for more mentions of that name. It appeared again and again, always in the context of duty, competence, trust. By the time Thatcher reached the final dated entry, his hands were shaking. May 18, 1944. Lieutenant Thomas Reeves came to my quarters tonight. He knows. I don't know how, but he's pieced together what I've only suspected. There's a traitor aboard this ship. Someone with connections high enough to access our sealed orders before we even departed Portsmouth. Reeves has been keeping his own log. Names, conversations, evidence. He told me he's going to bring formal charges when we make port. I tried to warn him that powerful men don't take kindly to exposure, but he wouldn't listen. He said some things are more important than career or safety. He said his son deserves to grow up in a country where honor still means something. I pray to God he lives long enough to see that boy again. I pray we all do. But I'm writing this entry knowing it might be the last thing I'd ever commit to paper. Because if someone aboard this vessel is willing to betray an entire mission for gold, they won't hesitate to silence anyone who knows the truth. I've hidden the evidence Reeves gathered. Not here, not anywhere obvious, but somewhere it might survive if we don't. Somewhere it might be found by someone who gives a damn about what's right. If you're reading this, whoever you are, know this Lieutenant Thomas Reeves was a good man, a father, a patriot. And if he's dead, it's because someone aboard this ship decided 30 pieces of silver were worth more than a man's life. The journal ended there. No final entry, no resolution, just blank pages in the weight of 80 years of silence. Thatcher set it down carefully as if it might shatter. His vision had gone blurry around the edges. Not from tears. He didn't cry anymore. But from something harder to name. A recognition, a connection that reached across decades and pulled him into a story he didn't understand yet, but could feel in his bones. He unrolled the schematics. They were incredibly detailed. Modifications made to the Wanderer's hull, hidden compartments, reinforced sections, a complex series of measurements and coordinates. That would mean nothing to most people, but everything to someone trained in naval architecture or covert operations. And there in the margin of the third sheet, written in the same precise hand as the journal entries, Thomas Reeves trusted me with his life. I failed him, but I will not fail his legacy. Let whoever finds this know the truth. Thatcher sat down hard in the folding chair beside the table. Ranger moved closer, pressed his shoulder against Thatcher's leg, a solid, warm presence that anchored him to the moment. The dog didn't whine or paw for attention. He just stood there, steady, the way he always did when Thatcher's breathing got uneven and the walls started closing in. Thomas Reeves, lieutenant, father, patriot. The name echoed in Thatcher's head with a weight he couldn't explain. He pulled out his phone. No signal this far out on the mudflats, but he downloaded offline copies of military personnel databases months ago during a sleepless night when the past felt too loud to ignore. He opened the search function. Typed Thomas Reeves USS Wanderer 1944. The results loaded slowly, but they loaded. And when they did, Thatcher's world tilted on its axis. There in faded digital scans of official Navy records was the service file for Lieutenant Thomas Aaron Reeves. Born 1918, Boston, Massachusetts, enlisted 1940, decorated for valor, assigned to USS Wanderer, April 1944, enlisted under next of kin, wife Clara Reeves, son David Reeves, age 2. David Reeves, born 1942. Thatcher's hands moved automatically, opening another search. The genealogy sites he'd used once to trace his own family history. He entered the name David Reeves, narrowed the parameters to Boston area post-war generation. The results came back fast. David Reeves married Helen Carter in 1965, had 2 sons, Michael in 1967 and Daniel in 1991. Daniel Aaron Reeves, named after his great-grandfather, the grandfather who disappeared at sea in 1944, under circumstances officially listed as lost during training exercises. No body recovered, no explanation given, just another casualty in a war that took so many the paperwork couldn't keep up. But Daniel had never known the real story. He'd grown up believing his great-grandfather died serving his country with honor. He joined the Navy himself at 18, following a legacy he didn't understand was built on lies and buried secrets. And Thatcher Kane had been the one to call the mission clear, to give the order that sent Daniel Reeves into the street where an IED was waiting, had been the one to carry his best friend's body out of that alley while the world burned around them, had been the one to stand at attention in dress blues while they folded a flag and handed it to Daniel's mother, a woman who had already lost too much and didn't know she was about to lose even more. The photograph on the wall seemed to pulse with accusation. Daniel's grin, frozen in time, unaware that he was 2 hours away from death, unaware that his best friend would survive, unaware that 80 years after his great-grandfather died searching for truth, someone would finally find it, and it would be too late to matter. Ranger's growl brought Thatcher back. Low, controlled, the sound of a dog who'd identified a threat. Thatcher looked up. Through the trailer's small window, he could see a vehicle moving slowly down the access road. Black sedan, too clean, too expensive for this part of Maine where rust claimed everything within months. The car stopped 50 yards from the trailer, sat there idling for a long moment, tinted windows revealing nothing. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, mid-40s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Thatcher had made in his last 6 months of military pay. His hair was styled with the kind of precision that required regular salon visits, and his shoes somehow remained unmuddied, despite the fact that he just stepped onto ground that was more liquid than solid this time of year. He looked around the ship graveyard with an expression that was equal parts disgust and calculation. Then his eyes found the trailer, found Thatcher standing in the doorway with Ranger at his side, and he smiled. It was not a friendly smile. The man approached with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. or if he had possessed the resources to make the problem disappear. He stopped 10 feet from the trailer, far enough to respect personal space, but close enough to make it clear he wasn't intimidated by the dog or the man holding its leash. "Mr. Kane, I presume," he said. His voice was smooth, educated, the kind of accent that came from prep schools and country clubs. "My name is Victor Sterling. I'm a property developer based out of Portland. I've been working on a rather exciting project along this stretch of coastline, and I believe your land represents a significant opportunity for both of us." Thatcher didn't respond, just watched. Ranger's growl had subsided, but the dog remained rigid, every sense locked on the stranger who'd appeared uninvited. Sterling seemed unbothered by the silence. He gestured broadly at the ship graveyard, at the rusted hulks and the mud and the fog that was starting to roll back in with the changing tide. "I'm prepared to make you an extremely generous offer, Mr. Kane. This property, as I'm sure you're aware, has been designated for potential environmental remediation. The state is very interested in cleaning up these old vessels, removing the hazards, returning the coastline to its natural beauty. I have connections with the regulatory agencies. I can make the transition seamless. You walk away with a substantial sum. I take on the burden of managing what is, let's be honest, a rather depressing inheritance. Everyone wins." Sterling pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, extended it toward Thatcher like an offering. "I took the liberty of having my attorneys draw up preliminary paperwork. The figure on page 3 represents my initial proposal. I think you'll find it more than fair for land that is functionally speaking worthless in its current state." Thatcher took the document, unfolded it, scanned the numbers without really seeing them. His mind was still back in 1944, still trying to piece together the story that Captain Hartley had died protecting, still seeing Daniel's face superimposed over the faded photograph of Thomas Reeves in his navy whites. When he looked up, Sterling was watching him with the kind of patience that came from practice. This man was used to waiting for people to come around to his way of thinking. "Not interested," Thatcher said. His voice was quiet, flat, the tone he'd used when briefing superiors on mission outcomes that had gone sideways. No emotion, just fact. Sterling's smile didn't falter, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of annoyance quickly suppressed. "I understand this must be overwhelming, Mr. Kane. Inheritances often are. But I would encourage you to think practically about this. You're a young man. You have your whole life ahead of you. Do you really want to spend it managing a toxic waste site? Because that's what this property is, legally speaking. Without proper environmental permits, you can't develop it, can't sell it to anyone else, can't even properly maintain it without triggering a cascade of regulatory requirements that would bankrupt most people. I'm offering you a way out, a clean break from a burden you never asked for." "Said I'm not interested," Thatcher replied. He folded the document without looking at it again, handed it back. Sterling accepted it with the kind of careful control that suggested he wasn't used to being refused. "May I ask why?" Sterling's voice remained pleasant, but there was an edge now, barely perceptible, like a scalpel hidden in silk. "Is it the money? Because I can assure you we have room to negotiate. Or perhaps it's sentimental attachment. I understand your great-uncle lived here for many years. But surely you can see that this isn't a life. This is a slow death by rust and isolation." Thatcher looked past Sterling to the ship graveyard beyond, to the wanderer listing in her pool of brackish water, to the secret she'd been hiding for 80 years until a German shepherd with better instincts than most humans had decided it was time for truth to surface. He thought about Thomas Reeves trusting a captain with his life, trusting his country with his honor, dying alone in circumstances that were erased from official records because someone decided convenience was more important than justice. He thought about Daniel following that same path decades later, believing the lie that service meant something, that honor mattered, that the people giving orders actually cared whether you came home. "The land's not for sale," Thatcher said. "Not to you, not to anyone. You can leave now." The pleasantness drained from Sterling's face like water from a ruptured hull. What remained was colder, harder, more honest. He looked at Thatcher the way a predator might study wounded prey, calculating odds and angles. Then his gaze shifted to the wanderer, lingered there for just a moment too long. And in that moment, Thatcher saw it. Recognition. Not curiosity about an old ship. Recognition of something specific. Something that made Sterling's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "This is unfortunate, Mr. Kane." Sterling's voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost regretful. "Almost. I had hoped we could resolve this like gentlemen, like businessmen with mutual interests. But I can see you're the sentimental type, the kind of man who gets attached to things that should have been scrapped decades ago." He paused. Let the words hang in the salt air. "My family has a long history with this coastline, Mr. Kane. Longer than you might imagine. And I have a personal interest in seeing certain relics of that history remain undisturbed. For everyone's sake, I trust you'll reconsider my offer once you've had time to reflect on how isolated you are out here, how vulnerable, how easily accidents happen in places where rusty metal and high tides create such unpredictable hazards." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise wrapped in deniability. Sterling held Thatcher's gaze for another moment, then turned and walked back to his sedan with the same unhurried confidence he'd arrived with. The car door closed with a sound that was almost gentle. The engine purred to life, and Victor Sterling drove away down the access road, leaving nothing behind except tire tracks in the mud and a certainty that this conversation was far from over. Ranger remained tense until the vehicle disappeared from view. Only then did the dog relax slightly, though his ears stayed forward, tracking sounds Thatcher couldn't hear. Inside the trailer, the journal and schematics lay on the table where they'd been left. Innocent-looking pieces of paper that contained enough truth to make powerful men nervous. Thatcher looked at them, looked at the photograph of Daniel on the wall, looked out at the wanderer settling deeper into the mudflat with the changing tide. Something was happening here. Something that connected a World War II cover-up to a modern developer with threats in his smile. Something that linked Thomas Reeves to Daniel Reeves across 3 generations in 80 years. And Thatcher Kane, who'd come to this graveyard to disappear, who'd wanted nothing more than to rust away alongside these forgotten ships, suddenly found himself standing at the center of a story that refused to stay buried. He picked up the journal again, started reading more carefully this time, looking for details he'd missed in the first pass. Names, locations, anything that might explain why Victor Sterling had looked at that ship like he was staring at a grave he'd hoped would stay sealed. The afternoon light was fading by the time Thatcher found it. A single entry buried in the middle of May 1944, written in Captain Hartley's increasingly paranoid hand. May 14th, 1944. Intercepted a communication tonight that wasn't meant for my ears. Lieutenant Reeves was right. The traitor is someone with access to naval intelligence briefings. Someone who knew our route before we did. I've narrowed it to 3 possibilities, but I can't prove anything without more evidence. What I do know is this: whoever sold us out has connections that reach far beyond the Navy. I heard a name tonight during that intercepted call. Sterling. Nathaniel Sterling, civilian contractor working with naval intelligence on logistics and supply chain operations. The kind of position that provides access to classified information without the burden of direct accountability. If Lieutenant Reeves is right, and I believe he is, then Sterling has been feeding our operational details to German intelligence in exchange for a share of whatever cargo they're smuggling. And if that's true, then Thomas Reeves is a dead man walking, because men like Sterling don't leave witnesses. Thatcher set down the journal with hands that had gone numb. Sterling, Nathaniel Sterling. He grabbed his phone again. Search for the name and connection with World War II naval intelligence. The results were sparse, but they existed. Nathaniel Sterling, born 1898, worked as a civilian logistics coordinator for the Navy during the war years. Died 1967, Portland, Maine. Survived by his son, Harrison Sterling. And Harrison Sterling had a son named Victor, born 1979, 45 years old. standing on Thatcher's property 3 hours ago with threats barely disguised as business proposals. The family connection was clear, but it was more than genetics. Victor Sterling had looked at the Wanderer with the kind of recognition that came from knowledge, from stories passed down through generations, from knowing that somewhere in that rusted hull was evidence of his grandfather's treason. Evidence that had stayed buried for 80 years but was now surfacing because a dog with better instincts than any human had decided to paw at the right piece of corroded steel. Thatcher walked to the window, looked out at the graveyard as twilight turned the ships into dark silhouettes against a darker sea. Ranger joined him, pressing his weight against Thatcher's leg in the silent communication they developed over years of working together. The dog knew, could sense the shift in the air, the change in Thatcher's breathing, the way his hand had unconsciously moved to rest on the handle of the folding knife he still carried on his belt, despite being thousands of miles from any combat zone. This wasn't over. Sterling would come back, or send people who were less interested in maintaining the pretense of civility. Men who understood that sometimes the only way to bury a secret was to bury anyone who knew about it. Thatcher had seen it before in places where American oversight was thin and local cooperation was expensive. He'd seen what happened to people who asked the wrong questions or found the wrong documents or simply knew too much at the wrong time. But Thatcher Kane was not a civilian stumbling into something he didn't understand. He was a Navy SEAL who'd spent a decade learning how to turn bad terrain into tactical advantage, who'd survived ambushes and firefights in IED blasts that should have killed him but somehow didn't, who'd been trained to read threats and respond with overwhelming precision before the other side knew the fight had started. And now he was standing on 40 acres of rusted metal and tidal pools with a German shepherd who could smell danger coming and a secret that 3 generations of powerful men had failed to erase. The first rule of combat was understanding your battlefield. Thatcher grabbed a headlamp from the storage bin beneath the cot, pulled on his work boots and a heavy jacket. Ranger was already at the door, tail up, ready to move. Together, they walked out into the gathering dark, back toward the Wanderer. The ship looked different now. Not just a wreck, a tomb, a monument to men who died trying to do the right thing, only to be erased from history by people who valued gold more than honor. Thatcher climbed aboard carefully. The deck was treacherous with rot and rust, but his footing was sure. He'd spent the last 6 months walking these ships, learning their rhythms, their weak points, their hidden spaces. The Wanderer creaked beneath his weight, but held. He made his way to what had been the captain's quarters, a small compartment near the stern, mostly intact despite decades of exposure to the elements. Inside was debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, the remnants of a life interrupted. He started searching, not randomly, methodically, the way he'd been trained to clear buildings in hostile territory. Every drawer, every cabinet, every loose panel, if Captain Hartley had hidden something else, something beyond the journal and schematics, it would be here, in the space where he'd spent his final days knowing that his crew included a traitor and his ship was carrying evidence that powerful men wanted destroyed. It took 2 hours, but Thatcher found it. Behind a false panel in what had once been a navigation desk, there was a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch, wrapped in wax paper that had somehow survived 8 decades, was a collection of letters, personal correspondence, and a single photograph. The photo showed 2 men in Navy uniforms standing on a dock somewhere sunny, California maybe, or Virginia. They were young, smiling. One of them wore lieutenant bars, Thomas Reeves. The other was older captain's insignia on his collar. James Hartley. The back of the photo was inscribed Brothers in Arms, May 1944. Whatever comes, we stood for something that mattered. The letters were more damning. Copies of communications between Nathaniel Sterling and a German contact outlining the exact coordinates and timing of the Wanderer's mission. Proof of treason typed on official Navy letterhead and initialed by Sterling himself. Proof that Captain Hartley had somehow intercepted and preserved. Proof that Thomas Reeves had died trying to expose. Proof that would have been enough to hang a man in 1944 and would certainly be enough to destroy a family's reputation in the present day. Thatcher carefully repacked the letters, climbed down from the Wanderer with the pouch secured in his jacket. Ranger was waiting at the base of the ship, ears forward, body tense. The dog had heard something, or smelled something, or sensed something in the way only military K9S could. Thatcher froze, listened. There, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, multiple sets, moving with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested training, not teenagers looking for scrap metal, not locals out for a walk. These were men who knew how to move quietly, how to approach without being seen, how to wait for the right moment. Thatcher clicked his tongue twice, the signal he'd used in Afghanistan when enemy contact was imminent. Ranger responded instantly, dropping into a low crouch, muscles coiled, waiting for the command to engage or evade. Thatcher's hand moved to his belt. No sidearm. He'd left that life behind. But he had the knife, and he had the terrain, and he had skills that didn't rust the way ships did. Two figures emerged from the fog, both wearing dark clothing, both moving with purpose toward the trailer. They hadn't seen Thatcher yet, didn't know he was behind them watching from the shadow of the Wanderer's hull. One of them carried a crowbar. The other had something that looked like a gas can. Their intention was clear. Break in, destroy, make it look like an accident, a vagrant shelter going up in flames, a tragedy in a place where nobody would ask too many questions. Thatcher moved, not toward them, toward a pile of scrap metal he'd been organizing for eventual removal. He picked up a length of chain, wrapped one end around his fist, let the other end dangle loose with a rusted shackle at the terminus. Then he threw a piece of corrugated steel toward the far side of the graveyard. It landed with a crash that echoed across the mudflats. Both intruders spun toward the sound, started moving in that direction, away from the trailer, exactly as intended. Thatcher came out of the dark behind them like something that had been waiting there all along. The chain caught the first man across the backs of his knees. He went down hard, face first into the mud, the crowbar flying from his hands. The second man turned, started to raise the gas can like a weapon, then froze as 80 pounds of German Shepherd appeared in front of him. Ranger didn't attack, didn't need to. He just stood there, teeth bared, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The kind of sound that bypass rational thought and speak directly to the part of the brain that understands predators. The man with the gas can dropped it, raised his hands, started backing away. His partner was still face down in the mud, groaning, trying to push himself up. Thatcher stepped forward into the light of his headlamp so they could see his face, see the expression that wasn't quite a smile, see the chain still wrapped around his fist, see the absolute calm of someone who'd done this before in places where the rules were different and the stakes were higher. "You boys lost." His voice was quiet, conversational, almost friendly. "This is private property. Easy to get turned around in the fog, I know. But now that you've found your way here, let's have a conversation about who sent you." Neither man spoke. The one in the mud managed to roll onto his side, spat out a mouthful of silt and salt water. Both of them were young, mid-20s, the kind of muscle that developers hired when they needed problems handled quietly. Not career criminals, just men who'd taken money to do something they probably told themselves wasn't that bad. Breaking into an empty trailer, burning some documents, nobody would get hurt, easy cash. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly hadn't expected a man who moved like Thatcher moved, who could use terrain and timing and the threat of controlled violence to end a confrontation before it began. Now they were reassessing their life choices while a German shepherd stood guard, and the man they'd come to intimidate asked questions in a tone that suggested he already knew the answers. "Sterling sent you, not a question, a statement." One of them flinched. "Confirmation." Thatcher nodded slowly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get up. You're going to walk back to whatever vehicle you came in. You're going to leave. And you're going to tell Mr. Sterling that his message was received but declined. Can you do that? The man who'd been carrying the gas can found his voice. He said nobody would be here, said the place was empty at night. Sterling says a lot of things, Thatcher replied. Most of them are lies. Now move, before I change my mind about letting you walk. They moved, scrambling to their feet, backing toward the access road without turning their backs on the dig or the man with the chain. They disappeared into the fog within seconds, footsteps fading into the sound of the tide. Thatcher waited until he heard an engine start, tires spinning in mud. The whine of a vehicle accelerating away faster than was safe on that narrow road. Only then did he unwind the chain from his fist, let it fall to the ground with a sound like bones settling. Ranger remained alert for another 5 minutes before finally relaxing. The dog circled back to Thatcher's side, accepted the scratch behind his ears that served as both praise and thanks. Together, they walked back to the trailer. Thatcher bolted the door, something he'd never bothered with before, wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Then he sat at the table with the journal and the letters spread out in front of him like pieces of a puzzle that was finally starting to take shape. Victor Sterling wasn't just trying to acquire land. He was trying to bury his family's shame, erase the evidence that his grandfather had committed treason, had sold out American servicemen for gold, had contributed to the death of Thomas Reeves and who knows how many others. And now that evidence was sitting on a table in a trailer in Port Hollow, Maine, in the hands of a man who had every reason to want justice for the things that powerful people thought they could hide. Thatcher looked at Daniel's photograph, at that frozen grin, at the innocence of a man who'd believed the lie that the system cared about honor. Daniel had died not knowing his great-grandfather had been murdered by the same kind of corruption, had died serving a country that had allowed traitors to prosper while patriots rotted in unmarked graves. But Thatcher knew now, and knowing changed everything. The restoration of the Wanderer, which had been nothing more than therapy to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling, suddenly became something else. A mission, a promise, a way to give Thomas Reeves the justice that had been denied for 80 years. A way to prove to Daniel's ghost that honor still meant something, that brotherhood still mattered, that some men still kept their promises even when keeping them was dangerous. Outside, the fog rolled in thick. The tide was changing, and somewhere in Portland, Victor Sterling was receiving a phone call from two men who'd failed to complete a simple job. Tomorrow would bring new threats, new attempts to silence or intimidate or remove the problem that Thatcher represented. But tonight, in a rusted trailer surrounded by ship corpses, a Navy SEAL who'd spent 3 years running from his past finally stopped running, finally found something worth fighting for, finally understood what his great-uncle's note had meant. Maybe you'll find what you're looking for. Not peace, not forgiveness, not escape from the ghosts, but purpose, the kind that comes from standing at the intersection of past and present and deciding that truth matters more than survival, that legacy matters more than safety, that some secrets once discovered carry an obligation that can't be ignored. Thatcher opened the schematics again, studied the modifications Captain Hartley had made to his ship, the hidden passages, the reinforced sections, the careful planning of a man who knew he was carrying something worth dying for and wanted to make sure it survived him. These weren't just blueprints, they were a map, a guide to finishing what had been started 80 years ago. And if Thatcher was going to see this through, if he was going to honor Thomas Reeves and Daniel Reeves and every man who'd ever been betrayed by people who should have protected them, he needed to understand the ship inside and out. He worked through the night, making notes, cross-referencing the journal entries with the technical drawings, building a picture of the Wanderer, not as she was now broken and rusting, but as she'd been in her final days. A vessel carrying secrets and lies, a crew divided by loyalty and greed, a captain trying desperately to preserve truth while watching his men die around him. And somewhere in all of it, a way forward, a path that would lead from this mudflat in Maine to whatever reckoning Victor Sterling had been trying to prevent. Dawn came gray and cold. Ranger stirred from his position by the door. Thatcher stood joints stiff from hours of sitting in the same position, mind buzzing with information and possibility. He looked out the window at the ship graveyard, at the Wanderer listing in her pool of brackish water, at the 40 acres of rusted metal that had seemed like a burden yesterday but looked like a fortress now. Sterling would come back, would send more men or take matters into his own hands, would escalate because that's what powerful people did when they felt threatened. But Thatcher had faced worse in places where backup was measured in hours instead of minutes, had survived situations where the terrain was hostile and the enemy knew the ground better than he did. And now he was on his own land, his own graveyard, with time to prepare and reason to stand. He picked up his phone. No signal still, but he'd drive into town later, make some calls. There was a hardware store owner named Wade Holloway who'd been friendly the few times Thatcher had needed supplies. Older guy, Navy veteran from the 70s. The kind of man who understood that some fights were worth having, even when the odds looked bad. The kind of man who might have tools and knowledge that could help turn a ship graveyard into something Victor Sterling would regret approaching. But first, Thatcher needed to do something he'd been avoiding for 3 years. He needed to call Daniel's mother. Needed to tell her that her son's great-grandfather hadn't died in a training accident, that Thomas Reeves had been murdered trying to expose corruption, that the family legacy Daniel had been so proud of wasn't a lie, but a truth that had been buried by people who valued convenience over justice. It would hurt her, would reopen wounds that had barely begun to scar. But she deserved to know. The Reeves family deserved to know that their patriarch had died a hero, not a footnote in a war that was too busy to care about individual tragedies. Thatcher stood, stretched, felt his spine crack in a way that the VA doctors kept warning him about. Ranger was already at the door, ready to start the day, ready to patrol the perimeter and check for threats and do all the things that military K9S never really stopped doing even when the war ended. Together they walked out into the morning, into the salt air and the sound of gulls, in the knowledge that everything had changed in the space of 24 hours, that the man who'd come here to disappear had instead been found. By a dog, by a secret, by a story that demanded to be told no matter the cost. And somewhere in Portland, Victor Sterling was making phone calls of his own, planning his next move, calculating risks and probabilities, underestimating the man standing in a ship graveyard who'd survived Kandahar and carried Daniel Reeves's body home and made promises to ghosts that he intended to keep. Sterling would learn, they always did, that some men don't scare easily, that some men see threats as invitations, that some men, when pushed, push back with everything they've learned in places where survival meant being harder and smarter and more ruthless than whoever was trying to kill you. The war was coming to Port Hollow, not with drones or artillery, but with something older, something personal. A fight between men who understood that power without honor was tyranny, and that truth once uncovered carried its own terrible momentum. The ships in the graveyard bore silent witness, rusted monuments to vessels that had served their purpose and been forgotten. But the Wanderer was different. She'd been waiting, holding her secrets, and now finally someone was listening. The work began at first light, not because Thatcher had slept, he hadn't, but because the tide had pulled back enough to expose the Wanderer's full hull, and there were things that needed to be done while the mudflat was walkable. He stood at the base of the ship with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hands, studying the vessel the way a surgeon might study a patient before making the first incision. Ranger sat beside him, silent and watchful ears, tracking the sounds of gulls fighting over something dead near the barrier rocks. The restoration wasn't about making the ship seaworthy. That would take years and resources Thatcher didn't have. This was about preservation, about stripping away decades of corrosion to reveal what Captain Hartley had built beneath, about following the schematics like a treasure map that led not to gold, but to truth. Every weld that needed redoing, every panel that had been modified, Every hidden space that might contain something Sterling's family had spent 80 years trying to erase. Thatcher started with the basics. Scraping rust. The rhythmic sound of metal against metal became a meditation. Each stroke of the wire brush removed a layer of oxidation and seemed to strip away a layer of the weight he had been carrying since Kandahar. His therapist at the VA had talked about finding constructive outlets for trauma, about channeling energy into physical tasks that produce visible results, about the importance of seeing progress, however small. She'd probably meant gardening or woodworking, but this worked too. This worked better, because every square inch of clean steel felt like reclaiming something that had been lost. And God knew Thatcher had lost enough. By noon, his shoulders burned and his hands were raw despite the gloves. But a 6-foot section of hull now gleamed dull gray instead of rust orange. The metal underneath was surprisingly intact. Captain Hartley had reinforced this section with welded plates that created a double hull. Extra protection for cargo or crew or both. The schematics showed similar modifications all along the waterline. Deliberate. Planned. The work of a man who knew his ship was carrying something worth defending. Thatcher heard the truck before he saw it. Old diesel engine that needed work. The sound rattled across the mud flats and echoed off the ship hulls. He straightened hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt before conscious thought caught up. Ranger was already on his feet, body language shifting from relaxed to alert, but the growl didn't come. The dog's tail moved once. Recognition. Someone familiar enough to not be a threat. The truck that appeared around the bend in the access road was a faded blue Ford from the 90s. Primer patches on the fenders. Bed full of lumber and supplies covered with a tarp. It stopped beside Thatcher's trailer, and the driver's door opened with a creak that suggested hinges hadn't seen oil in years. The man who stepped out was somewhere north of 65, but moved like he was younger. Broad shoulders, work-hardened hands, the kind of weathered face that came from decades of coastal wind and honest labor. Wade Holloway. Thatcher had met him twice before. Once when buying marine-grade epoxy, once when a pipe had burst in the trailer and Wade had driven out personally with parts and tools, refusing payment because, as he'd put it, Navy takes care of Navy. He was wearing the same canvas work jacket both times, same steel-toed boots, same baseball cap with the logo of a hardware store that had probably been in his family for generations. "Heard you might be starting a project out here," Wade called out, walking toward Thatcher with the easy confidence of a man who knew he was welcome. "Thought I'd bring some supplies." "On the house. Call it an investment in seeing something good happen on this coastline for once." Thatcher wiped rust from his hands on a rag. "Didn't order anything." "Didn't say you did." Wade stopped a few feet away, looking past Thatcher to the section of cleaned hull. "But word travels in a small town, especially when city developers start making noise about environmental remediation and eminent domain. Sterling's been talking to the county commissioners, talking to state regulators, making the kind of inquiries that usually means someone's about to lose their land, whether they want to sell or not." The confirmation of what Thatcher had suspected settled in his gut like bad food. Sterling wasn't going to wait, wasn't going to play the long game. He was moving pieces on a board Thatcher was only just beginning to see. Wade seemed to read the expression on his face because the older man's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he had seen this play out before. "I fought in Vietnam," Wade said. His voice was matter of fact, not looking for sympathy or respect. Just stating a fact. Came home to find out the VA benefits I'd been promised didn't cover a quarter of what they said they would. Came home to a country that didn't want to talk about where I'd been or what I'd seen. Spent my first 6 months back working 3 jobs to keep my dad's hardware store from going under because the bank had decided war service wasn't the same as business experience. I know what it looks like when powerful people decide you don't matter. And I'll be damned if I'm going to watch it happen to another veteran without at least offering to help." Thatcher studied the older man, saw the truth in the lines around his eyes, the kind of truth that came from experience, not performance. Why? Because some fights are worth having, even when you know you might lose. Wade gestured at the Wanderer, because that ship matters to you for reasons that have nothing to do with property value. And because Victor Sterling's is a bully with money and connections, which makes him dangerous, but not invincible. I've lived in Port Hollow my whole life. I know things about how this town works, how the county works, how to slow down bureaucracy when it needs slowing. And I have tools, he smiled. Not much, just enough. You're going to need better tools if you're serious about restoring a World War II patrol boat with nothing but determination and rage. It wasn't an offer Thatcher had expected. Wasn't help he'd thought to ask for. But standing there on the mud flat with rust under his nails and Sterling's threats still echoing in his mind, he recognized the value of an ally who understood the terrain. Not just the physical landscape, but the political one, the human one, the kind of knowledge that couldn't be learned from schematics or tactical manuals. Appreciate it, Thatcher said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. Wade nodded like he understood perfectly. Together they unloaded the truck. Angle grinder, welding equipment, primer and marine paint, lumber for scaffolding. Enough supplies to keep the work going for weeks. Wade didn't ask questions about why Thatcher was doing this. Didn't pry into the journal or the letters or the secrets that were driving this obsession. He just helped carry materials and offered advice on the best techniques for working with the corroded metal and how to reinforce weak points without compromising the ship's original structure. By the time Wade left, the sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, and Thatcher had a workspace that looked almost professional. The older man paused before climbing back into his truck, one hand on the open door, looking at Thatcher with an expression that carried weight. "Sterling's going to push harder," Wade said. "Men like him always do when they realize intimidation isn't working. You need to be ready for that, not just physically, legally, politically. This fight won't be won with fists or tools. It'll be won with documentation and witnesses and making enough noise that what he's trying to bury becomes too public to ignore." "I know." Thatcher's voice was quiet but certain. "That's the plan." Wade's expression shifted, something like approval or recognition. "If you need anything, if things get complicated, you have my number. Use it. Navy takes care of Navy." The truck rattled back down the access road, leaving Thatcher alone with his dog and his ghosts and a ship that was starting to look less like a corpse and more like something that might rise again. He went back to work. The physical labor helped, kept his hands busy, kept his mind from spiraling into the places it went when left idle. But part of his attention was always on the schematics, on the cipher that Captain Hartley had embedded in the technical drawings. A sequence of numbers and coordinates that didn't quite make sense as engineering specifications, but might mean something else entirely if approached the right way. Thatcher had been trained in basic cryptography during his SEAL qualification course. Nothing sophisticated, just enough to recognize patterns and apply logical decryption methods to field communications that might have been compromised. The schematic markings looked random at first, measurements that were slightly off, coordinates that didn't align with standard naval notation. But when he cross-referenced them with entries from the journal looking for dates and times and locations that appeared in both documents, a pattern emerged. It took 3 days. 3 days of working on the hull during daylight hours and studying the papers at night while Ranger kept watch and the fog rolled in, heavy enough to make the world disappear beyond the trailer windows. 3 days of testing different cipher keys and elimination methods. And then on the third night, with his eyes burning from exhaustion and his coffee gone cold for the fourth time, Thatcher saw it. The coordinates weren't ship specifications. They were references to the journal, page numbers, line numbers. If you took the first letter of specific words on specific lines and arranged them in sequence, they spelled out directions. Not complex directions, simple ones. The kind that assumed whoever was reading them would be standing in a particular location and would understand the context. Check footlocker, false bottom, northeast corner. Thatcher looked at the table. At the captain's footlocker he had been using as a workbench for weeks, the same footlocker he'd found the letters in. But he'd only checked the obvious hiding spot, the false panel behind the navigation desk. He'd never thought to examine the footlocker itself, never considered that something meant to hold a man's personal belongings might have been modified to hold something more valuable than clothes and letters. He stood, moved the journal and schematics aside, tilted the footlocker to study its construction in the light of the bare bulb overhead. The bottom was wooden, solid planks that had warped slightly with age and humidity. He pressed on each corner. The northeast section gave slightly, not much, just enough to suggest there was space beneath where there shouldn't be. Thatcher grabbed a flathead screwdriver, worked it into the seam, applied pressure. The wood resisted, then gave way with a crack that sounded too loud in the small trailer. Beneath the false bottom was a cavity lined with oilcloth. Inside the cavity was another bundle of documents. These were different from the letters. These were official. Naval intelligence briefings, communications intercepts, financial records showing payments from German accounts to a bank in Portland, Maine. All of it stamped with classification markers that should have made these documents impossible to remove from secure facilities. All of it signed or initialed by Nathaniel Sterling. But there was more. A leather folder containing a single legal document, a deed. Property transfer paperwork for a parcel of waterfront land in Port Hollow, Maine. The original owner listed as Thomas Aaron Reeves. The transfer date listed as May 20th, 1944, 2 days after Captain Hartley's final journal entry. The receiving party listed as Nathaniel Sterling. The signature at the bottom was a forgery. Thatcher could tell even without expertise because the signature didn't match the one on Thomas Reeves's service records. The handwriting was close but not perfect. Someone had practiced, had gotten good enough to fool a county clerk in 1944 who probably wasn't looking too carefully at paperwork signed by men who just died in service to their country. Sterling hadn't just committed treason. He'd stolen from the family of the man he'd helped murder, had used forged documents to claim property that should have passed to Thomas Reeves' widow and son. And over the decades that land had appreciated, had become valuable waterfront real estate, the foundation of the Sterling family's wealth, built on theft and murder and lies that had been maintained for 3 generations. Thatcher sat back. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about exposing a World War II cover-up. This was about unraveling a family fortune built on crimes that had compounding consequences. Daniel's grandfather, Daniel's father, Daniel himself, all of them had grown up poor because the land that should have been their inheritance had been stolen. All of them had struggled, had made choices driven by economic necessity. Daniel had joined the Navy partly because college wasn't affordable, and partly because he'd wanted to honor a great-grandfather he'd never met. A great-grandfather whose legacy had been a lie maintained by people who valued money more than truth. The rage that filled Thatcher wasn't hot. It was cold, precise, the kind that came from understanding exactly what had been taken and from whom. He picked up his phone. Still no signal, but he'd drive into town tomorrow. There were calls to make, research to do. He needed to find out who owned the Sterling land now. Needed to trace the property records forward from 1944 to the present. Needed to understand the full scope of what had been stolen so he could figure out how to give it back. But first he needed to find Thomas Reeves' family, or what remained of it. The service records listed a widow named Clara, a son named David. Thatcher had traced the line forward to Daniel, but there had to be others. Siblings, cousins, someone who carried the Reeves name and deserved to know that their ancestor hadn't died in a training accident, that he'd been murdered defending honor against men who'd sold it for gold. The search took most of the night. Public records, genealogy databases, obituaries and census data. Clara Reeves had died in 1967. David Reeves had died in 2003. But David had a sister, Margaret, born 1948, Still alive according to the databases. Last known address in Portland. Thatcher wrote down the information, stared at it. Margaret Reeves, Daniel's aunt, the last living direct descendant of Thomas Aaron Reeves. The woman who should have inherited waterfront property worth millions, but instead had nothing because her father had been robbed by the same family that was now trying to rob Thatcher. He'd find her tomorrow, after he made the other calls, after he set in motion the things that needed to happen to turn evidence into action. But tonight he sat with the weight of it all. The journal, the letters, the deed, the photograph of two men who'd believed honor mattered, who'd died believing it, who'd been proven wrong by a world that rewarded theft and punished integrity. Ranger stirred from his position by the door, came over, pressed his head against Thatcher's knee. The dog didn't understand the documents or the implications or the scope of corruption they represented, but he understood his human was hurting, was carrying something heavy, and he did what he'd been trained to do, provided comfort, anchor, a reminder that loyalty still existed even when everything else seemed rotten. Thatcher scratched behind the dog's ears, looked out the window at the darkness beyond. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Sterling would escalate, would use every resource at his disposal to stop this from becoming public, would threaten and bribe and manipulate. But tonight, Thatcher had something Sterling didn't. He had the truth, complete and documented and impossible to deny. And he had a reason to fight that went deeper than self-preservation. He was fighting for men who couldn't fight for themselves anymore. For Daniel, for Thomas, for every veteran who'd been betrayed by people who should have protected them. The drive into Portland the next morning took 40 minutes. Thatcher left Ranger at the trailer with instructions to guard. The dog would alert if anyone approached, would buy time if Sterling sent more men. In town, Thatcher found a coffee shop with Wi-Fi and spent 2 hours making calls, first to Daniel's mother. That conversation was as hard as he'd anticipated. Hearing her voice crack when he explained about Thomas Reeves, hearing her cry when she understood that Daniel had died, never knowing his great-grandfather had been a hero instead of a footnote, but she thanked him, through tears, had said Daniel would have wanted the truth to come out, had asked what she could do to help. The second call was to a lawyer, pro bono veterans advocacy, the kind of attorney who took cases that mattered more than they paid. Thatcher explained the situation, the deed, the forgery, the stolen land. The lawyer listened, asked smart questions, requested copies of the documents, said he'd need time to research, but that this sounded like fraud on a scale that might interest the state attorney general, might interest federal prosecutors given the military intelligence component. The third call was to Wade. Thatcher kept it brief, told him to be careful, told him Sterling might retaliate against anyone seen helping. Wade had laughed, not mocking, grim, let him try. By early afternoon, Thatcher had compiled digital copies of everything: the journal, the letters, the financial records, the forged deed. He uploaded them to secure cloud storage with multiple backup locations, sent encrypted copies to the lawyer and to Daniel's mother and to a journalist in Boston who specialized in investigative reporting about military corruption. Insurance. If something happened to the physical documents, if something happened to him, the truth would still exist, would still have a chance at daylight. Finding Margaret Reeves took longer. The address on file was for a homeless shelter in Portland's industrial district. Thatcher drove there, parked across the street, watched people come and go. Most of them were men, older, weathered by lives that had gone sideways somewhere along the line. But there were women too, a few, and one of them sitting on the shelter's front steps with a plastic bag of belongings looked like she might be the right age. Thatcher approached carefully. She watched him come, wary. People in shelters learn to be wary. Learn that strangers usually wanted something, and whatever they wanted usually wasn't good. He stopped a respectful distance away, hands visible, body language open. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Margaret Reeves." Her eyes narrowed. Who's asking? My name is Thatcher Kane. I'm a friend of your nephew. Daniel, I have information about your father that I think you deserve to hear. The wariness didn't leave her face, but something else joined it. Curiosity, or maybe pain. The kind that came from hearing a name you tried to forget because remembering hurt too much. Daniel's dead. I know. I was with him when it happened. The truth came out flat, factual. The only way Thatcher knew how to deliver it anymore. He was my best friend. And I just found out that your father didn't die the way the Navy said he did. He was murdered by people who stole land that should have belonged to your family. Land that's worth millions now. Land that would have changed everything for you and your brother and Daniel. Margaret Reeves stared at him. For a long moment, she didn't speak, just searched his face for signs of deception or cruelty, or whatever con she thought this might be. Then she stood, slowly, like her joints hurt. I need to see proof. Thatcher pulled out his phone, showed her the photograph of Thomas Reeves, showed her the service records, showed her the forged deed with her father's signature that didn't quite match. Watched her face as she processed what she was seeing. Watched the progression from disbelief to shock to a kind of fury that was all the more powerful for being controlled. The Sterling family, she said. Her voice was quiet but sharp as broken glass. They did this. Yes. And now they want to bury it. Want to make sure nobody ever finds out. Yes, Margaret looked at him. Really looked. Seeing past the surface to whatever drove him, whatever made a stranger care about injustices from before he was born. Why are you doing this? What do you get out of it? Peace, Thatcher said. And it was true. Your nephew died believing he was honoring a legacy that turned out to be a lie. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure the truth comes out, can make sure your father gets the recognition he deserved, can maybe get back some of what was stolen from your family. That's not nothing. She studied him for another long moment, then nodded. What do you need from me? Permission to fight this battle using your father's name. Testimony about how your family struggled financially. Anything you remember your father telling you about Thomas Reeves before he died. My father didn't talk about it much, Margaret said. But I remember he used to say his own father had died trying to do the right thing. That some men pay a higher price for honor than others. I never understood what he meant. I thought it was just the way veterans talk about war. But it was more than that, wasn't it? He knew something was wrong. Knew his father hadn't just died in an accident. I think he suspected Thatcher agreed, but he couldn't prove anything. The records were sealed. The evidence was hidden. Until now. Margaret's hands were shaking slightly as she handed the phone back. I've been living in shelters for 6 years, ever since my husband died and the medical bills took everything. I've got nothing left except my name and the memory of men who tried to be good in a world that didn't reward it. If you can make the Sterling family pay for what they did, if you can give my father's memory the honor it deserves, then you have my permission. You have my blessing. And if you need me to testify or sign documents or stand in front of cameras and tell the world how that family built their fortune on my father's grave, I'll do it. The conviction in her voice was absolute. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about dignity, about a woman who had lost everything, understanding that there were still battles worth fighting, still truths worth defending. Thatcher got her contact information, promised to keep her updated, gave her the lawyer's number in case anything happened to him. Then he drove back to Port Hollow with the final piece of the puzzle in place. Margaret Reeves. Living proof that the Sterling family's crimes had consequences that echoed across generations. Living witness to what happened when powerful people decided profit mattered more than justice. He was halfway back to the ship graveyard when his phone rang. Wade's number. Thatcher answered. Yeah. Wade's voice was tight, controlled, but underneath was fury. Sterling's men just hit my store, came in this afternoon with crowbars and a story about inspecting for code violations, tore through the back office, destroyed my computer, smashed my file cabinets, told my employees they were just doing their jobs, but made it real clear this was a message. For me, For you, for anyone thinking about standing in Sterling's way. The cold rage that had been building in Thatcher's chest crystallized into something harder, something actionable. Anyone hurt my nephew was working the register. Kid's 19. They shoved him into a wall hard enough to leave a mark, told him accidents happen when people don't mind their own business. But he's okay, scared, angry, but okay. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate. This is my fight. You shouldn't have gotten caught in it. Too late for that, Wade said. And I'm not backing down. But you need to know Sterling's not playing anymore. This was escalation. Next time it might be worse. You need to be ready. Thatcher was already calculating, already planning. I will be free. And Wade, thank you for not walking away when you had the chance. Navy takes care of Navy, Wade replied. Then he hung up. The trailer was undisturbed when Thatcher arrived. Ranger greeted him with the calm efficiency of a dog who'd been on patrol all day and had nothing to report. But Thatcher wasn't taking chances anymore. He spent the next 2 hours reinforcing the trailer's security. Motion sensors connected to his phone, trail cameras positioned around the property perimeter. Simple trip wires made from fishing line and empty cans. Nothing sophisticated, just enough warning to know when unwelcome visitors were approaching. Then he turned his attention back to the Wanderer. Sterling had shown his hand. Violence, intimidation, destruction of property. All of it calculated to make Thatcher back down, to make the cost of fighting higher than the value of winning. But Sterling had miscalculated, had assumed Thatcher was like other people, motivated by self-preservation, willing to walk away when the price got too high. Sterling didn't understand what Kandahar had taught, what carrying Daniel's body through fire and chaos had burned into Thatcher's soul, that some promises were worth keeping no matter what it cost. That honor wasn't a luxury you abandoned when things got hard. It was the thing you held on to precisely because everything else had been stripped away. The work on the ship took on new urgency. Every panel cleaned, every modification documented, every hidden space searched. Captain Hartley had left breadcrumbs, clues embedded in the ship's construction. Thatcher followed them methodically, found another cache of documents behind a false bulkhead in the engine room, found personal effects that had belonged to Thomas Reeves, a watch, dog tags, a letter to his wife that had never been mailed. The letter was dated May 17th, 1944, one day before Captain Hartley's final journal entry. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it home, and I'm sorry for that. Sorry you'll raise David alone. Sorry I won't be there to see him grow into the man I know he'll become. But I need you to know I didn't die for nothing. There are things happening aboard this ship that are wrong, things I can't ignore. Captain Hartley is a good man, but he's afraid. Afraid of people more powerful than us. People who can make evidence disappear and turn patriots into traitors with a few strokes of a pen. I've gathered proof of what they've done. Proof of who's been selling us out. Hartley has promised to hide it where it might survive even if we don't. Where someday someone might find it and understand. I don't know if that day will ever come, but I have to believe it will. Have to believe honor still means something. Tell David his father loved him. Tell him to be brave and honest even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Tell him some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost. All my love, Thomas. Thatcher read the letter 3 times. By the 3rd reading, his vision had blurred and his hands were unsteady, and he had to set it down before the paper absorbed moisture it had survived 80 years without encountering. This wasn't just evidence. This was a voice across time, a father talking to his son, a man facing death and choosing to leave words of love instead of words of fear. It was everything Thatcher wished he could have said to Daniel. Everything he'd never get the chance to say because war didn't give you time for poetry, just for action and consequence and trying to live with both. He carefully preserved the letter in plastic. added it to the collection of documents that were building into something that couldn't be ignored. Then he went back to work on the hull. The sun was setting, the tide was coming in. But Thatcher kept working by headlamp, kept following the schematics, kept uncovering the ship that Captain Hartley and Thomas Reeves had died trying to protect. And with every piece of rust, he scraped away every modification he documented. Every secret he exposed, he could feel Sterling's desperation growing. The phone rang at midnight. Unknown number. Thatcher almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Sterling's voice came through calm and measured. "Mr. Kane, I hope I'm not disturbing your evening. What do you want?" "To offer you one final opportunity to avoid unnecessary unpleasantness. I've filed paperwork with the State Environmental Agency requesting an emergency inspection of your property. Given the nature of the contamination present in deteriorating ship hulls, I believe they'll find sufficient cause for immediate remediation, which will require removing all vessels from the site at your expense, unless, of course, we can reach an agreement that makes such drastic measures unnecessary." The threat was clear, wrapped in bureaucratic language but unmistakable. Sterling could use regulations and government agencies to destroy everything Thatcher was trying to preserve, could bury the Wanderer in red tape and compliance costs, could make it legally impossible to continue the work without spending money Thatcher didn't have. "You attacked Wade's store," Thatcher said. "Not a question. A statement. I have no knowledge of any incident involving Mr. Holloway's business, though I understand accidents do happen, particularly when people involve themselves in situations they don't fully understand. You're threatening me. I'm offering you a choice." Sterling's voice remained pleasant, almost friendly. "Walk away with compensation and your life intact, or continue down this path and discover just how isolated you really are, how easily a property can be condemned, how quickly veterans' benefits can be reviewed and potentially revoked if questions arise about mental fitness. I have resources you can't imagine, Mr. Kane, and I will use them to protect my family's interests. This is your last chance to make the smart choice." Thatcher stood in the darkness of his trailer, looked at the evidence spread across the table, at the photograph of Daniel on the wall, at Ranger watching him with patient understanding. "You're right about one thing. I am isolated, but you're wrong about what that means. Means I don't have much to lose. Means I can focus on what matters without worrying about collateral damage. Means I can be patient and thorough and absolutely relentless. Your grandfather murdered Thomas Reeves, stole his land, built your family fortune on fraud. And I have proof, all of it, documented and distributed. You can threaten me all you want, can send more men or more lawyers or more government agencies. But the truth is already out there. Multiple copies, multiple witnesses. You can't bury this. Not anymore." Silence on the other end. Then Sterling's voice came back colder. "You've made your choice. Live with the consequences." The line went dead. Thatcher set down the phone. Outside, the wind was picking up. Storm coming. He could smell it in the salt air, could feel it in the pressure change. Ranger moved to the door, alert but not alarmed, ready for whatever came next. And Thatcher Kane stood in the small trailer, surrounded by ghosts and evidence, and the absolute certainty that he'd just declared war on a man who played by different rules, a man who valued power over truth, convenience over justice, a man who would escalate because that's what men like him always did when faced with resistance. But Thatcher had fought in places where the enemy had every advantage, where air support was hours away and extraction was a maybe, where survival meant being harder and smarter and more committed than whoever wanted you dead. And he'd survived, not intact, not whole, but alive. And now he had a mission that mattered more than any objective he'd been given in uniform. Protecting the legacy of men who died trying to do the right thing, honoring promises made to friends who weren't here to see them kept, standing against corruption that had compounded for 3 generations and left good people broken while bad people prospered. The storm broke an hour later. rain hammering against the trailer's thin walls, wind shrieking across the mudflats, lightning illuminating the ship graveyard in stark white flashes that turned the vessels into skeletal monuments. Thatcher didn't sleep. Instead, he sat at the table making plans, contingencies, backup strategies. The lawyer had the documents, the journalist had the story, Margaret Reeves had her testimony. Daniel's mother had her grief turned into purpose. Every piece was in place, every safeguard established. If Sterling wanted to fight, Thatcher was ready. But this wouldn't be a fight won with violence. It would be one with exposure, with making the crime so public that no amount of money or influence could bury them again. By dawn, the storm had passed. The mudflats were slick with rain, and the ships dripped with runoff. But the Wanderer stood where she'd stood for decades, waiting, holding her secrets. And Thatcher Kane walked out into the gray morning light with Ranger at his side and a certainty in his chest that felt almost like peace, almost like purpose. The fight was coming. Sterling would make his move, would try to destroy everything Thatcher had built. But for the first time since Kandahar, Thatcher wasn't running from ghosts. He was standing with them, honoring them, giving them the justice they died believing mattered. And if that meant standing alone against people with power and resources and complete absence of conscience, so be it. Some fights were worth having, some promises were worth keeping, and some men, when pushed, discovered they had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The preparation took 5 days. 5 days of transforming the ship graveyard from a passive inheritance into something tactical, something defensible. Thatcher moved through the work with the methodical precision of a man who planned ambushes in Helmand Province and understood that terrain won battles more often than firepower. Every rusted hull became a piece of the puzzle, every tidal pool a natural obstacle, every sight line calculated and exploited. Wade arrived on the second day with more supplies than Thatcher had requested. Tripwire, motion sensors, floodlights that could be triggered remotely. The older man didn't ask questions about what Thatcher was planning, just helped string cable between ships and test the systems until they worked reliably. They moved like soldiers, economical, focused, speaking only when necessary, and then in the clipped shorthand of men who'd learned communication under fire. "He's coming," Wade said on the third day. Not a question, a certainty. Sterling doesn't make threats he doesn't intend to follow through on, and you've backed him into a corner. Made it public. The journalist in Boston called my store yesterday asking for comment. That means the story's real. Means Sterling's running out of time to make this go away quietly. Thatcher nodded. He'd seen the article. Front page of the Portland Herald. Naval intelligence scandal surfaces after 80 years. Local developer's family accused of wartime treason. The reporter had done thorough work. Interviews with Margaret Reeves, statements from Daniel's mother, expert analysis of the forged deed, photographs of the journal and letters. Everything laid out in language that was careful enough to avoid libel, but clear enough to destroy reputations. Sterling had responded with denials. His lawyers had issued statements calling the allegations baseless attacks on a respected business family. But the evidence was too substantial to dismiss. The state attorney general's office had announced an investigation. Federal prosecutors were reviewing the military intelligence component. And the land deed was being challenged in court by Margaret Reeves with pro bono legal representation from 3 different veterans advocacy groups. The story had momentum now. Sterling couldn't stop it with money or connections, but he could still make Thatcher pay for starting it, could still exact revenge in the physical space while the legal battles played out in courtrooms. And Thatcher was ready for that, had been preparing for it since the night Sterling made his final threat. The Wanderer sat at the center of the defensive position. Thatcher had used the schematics to map every passage and compartment, had tested the secret routes Captain Hartley had built into the hull structure. The ship wasn't just a monument anymore. It was a fortress. 3 approach paths from the access road, all of them channeled through kill zones where motion sensors would trigger lights and alarms. Two escape routes if retreat became necessary. One through the engine room to a gap in the stern plating. Another through the forward hold to a ladder that led down into tidal caves only accessible at low water. Ranger learned the layout in 2 days. The dog moved through the ship like he'd been born aboard, knew which passages were wide enough for a man, which compartments offered concealment, which routes led to dead ends, and which offered tactical advantage. Thatcher had trained him using hand signals and the kind of patient repetition that built muscle memory. Now the dog could navigate the Wanderer in complete darkness and lead Thatcher to any position on command. On the 5th day, Wade brought something unexpected. A shotgun, Remington 870 12 gauge, the kind of weapon that didn't require precision at close range, just commitment. Thatcher held it, felt the familiar weight, the balance that spoke to years of design refinement. He hadn't wanted this, hadn't wanted to turn the graveyard into a combat zone. But Sterling had made choices that narrowed options, had escalated from threats to violence. And Thatcher knew from experience that men who sent others to do their dirty work eventually came themselves when the hired help failed. Don't have to use it, Wade said quietly, but better to have it and not need it than the alternative. Sterling's not just coming for your property. He's coming to make sure you can't testify, can't stand in court and tell a jury what you found. Dead men can't give depositions. The truth of it settled heavy. Thatcher had known on some level, had felt it in Sterling's voice during that last phone call. The shift from intimidation to something colder, more final. This wasn't about scaring Thatcher off anymore. This was about removing a problem permanently, making it look like an accident in a place where accidents were believable. A veteran with PTSD living alone in a dangerous environment, tragic but inevitable. The kind of story that made it into local newspapers for one day and then disappeared. I appreciate this, Thatcher said. Meant it. Wade nodded, didn't say anything more. Just help Thatcher clean the weapon and load shells and find a position inside the Wanderer where the shotgun could be accessed quickly but remained hidden from casual observation. Then the older man left, drove away in his truck with a final warning to call if anything looked wrong, to not try to handle this alone if it went sideways. But Thatcher knew he would handle it alone. That was the nature of this fight. Wade had a business, a family, people who depended on him. Thatcher had Ranger and ghosts and a promise made to men who couldn't hear it anymore. That math was simple. That calculation required no debate. He would stand, would face whatever Sterling sent, would protect the evidence and the truth and the legacy of Thomas Reeves, even if it meant becoming another name on a memorial wall. The attack came on the 6th night. Thatcher was working inside the Wanderer when Ranger's low growl cut through the sound of rain against metal hull. The dog had been sleeping near the engine room, but now stood rigid, ears forward, body angled toward the starboard passage. Thatcher killed his work light, moved to the position he had prepared, retrieved the shotgun and waited in darkness while his eyes adjusted and his breathing steadied, and the combat reflexes he'd spent 3 years trying to forget came flooding back with terrible clarity. The motion sensors triggered first. Silent alerts to his phone. 4 separate pings from different positions around the property perimeter. Multiple contacts approaching from different directions. Coordinated, professional, not random vandals or desperate thugs. This was organized, planned, the kind of operation that required advanced reconnaissance and tactical coordination. Sterling hadn't sent amateurs this time. He'd sent people who knew what they were doing. Thatcher watched through a gap in the hull plating as shadows moved across the mudflats. 4 men, maybe 5, hard to count in the rain and darkness. They spread out as they advanced, maintaining intervals, covering each other's movement, using hand signals, military or law enforcement training. Definitely not local muscle hired for intimidation. These were professionals, and they were moving toward the Wanderer with purpose. The first man reached the ship's port side, started to climb the damaged section where rust had created handholds. Thatcher let him get halfway up before triggering the floodlight, positioned 20 feet away. The sudden illumination caught the climber exposed, blinded, off balance. Thatcher didn't shoot, just racked the shotgun. The metallic sound carried across the water, unmistakable. The climber froze, slowly raised his hands, started to descend. "That's far enough." Thatcher's voice cut through the rain, calm, authoritative, the tone he'd used when clearing buildings in Fallujah. "All of you, stop where you are. Put your hands where I can see them. This is private property, and you're trespassing." For a moment, nothing happened. The men stood like statues in the floodlight's harsh glare. Then one of them spoke. Older voice, confident. "We're not here to hurt you, Mr. Kane. We're here to deliver a message from Mr. Sterling. He's willing to pay you $2 million cash to walk away from this property tonight. Leave the documents. Leave the ship. Just walk away and never come back. That's the offer. Take it or leave it." $2 million. More money than Thatcher would earn in a lifetime. Enough to disappear. Start over somewhere Sterling's reach didn't extend. Enough to make the rational choice easy. Except nothing about this situation was rational. This was about honor and legacy and keeping promises to dead men who believed those things mattered. $2 million couldn't buy that. Couldn't erase the knowledge of what Sterling's family had done. Couldn't make Thatcher into the kind of man who took blood money and called it victory. "Not interested," Thatcher said. "Turn around, leave. Don't come back. Next time I won't be this polite." The spokesman's tone shifted, less friendly, more matter of fact. "Mr. Sterling anticipated you might say that. He asked me to clarify the situation. You're alone out here. No witnesses, no help coming. No one will question what happens. Accidents occur, especially around dangerous demolition sites. You have one more chance to take the money and live, or you can die protecting worthless metal and old paper. Your choice." It wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution notice with a 30-second delay. Thatcher felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the same detachment that had kept him functional when incoming fire turned the world into chaos, when thinking meant dying and action meant maybe surviving. He'd sworn he was done with this, done with violence and combat and the calculations that turned human beings into targets. But Sterling had forced the choice, had brought the war to Thatcher's doorstep because powerful men always assumed force would triumph over principle. "Ranger," Thatcher said it quietly. "Scatter." The German shepherd exploded from the shadows. Didn't attack, just ran between the intruders at full speed, barking with the kind of controlled aggression that created chaos without commitment. The men spun, tracking the dog with weapons, trying to establish firing solutions in the confusion. Thatcher used the distraction, moved through the Wanderer's interior using the passages he'd memorized, came out on the starboard side behind their position, triggered a second floodlight that caught them in cross-illumination. "Drop the weapons." His voice came from a different direction now. Disorienting. The tactical advantage of knowing terrain better than your enemy. "Do it now or this gets ugly." One of them made the wrong choice, raised his weapon toward where he thought Thatcher's voice originated. Thatcher fired into the mud 3 feet from the man's position. The shotgun blast was deafening in the confined space between ship hulls. The spray of water and silt and scattered shot made the man drop and roll reflexively. When he came up, his weapon was gone, lost in the dark water. "Anyone else want to test me?" Thatcher racked another shell. The sound echoed across the graveyard like a death knell. The remaining men looked at each other. These weren't fanatics. They were hired contractors. Professionals who understood risk versus reward. Fighting a dug-in defender on his own ground at night in the rain wasn't worth whatever Sterling was paying. Not when the target was clearly willing to shoot and knew how to use terrain. The spokesman raised his hands higher. "We're leaving. But this isn't over. Sterling will come himself, and when he does, you won't see him coming." They withdrew, moving backward, maintaining spacing and security until they were beyond the floodlight's reach. Then they ran. Thatcher heard engines start in the distance, vehicles driving away fast enough to suggest fear. He waited another 10 minutes before lowering the shotgun, before calling Ranger back, before allowing himself to breathe normally again. The dog appeared from the darkness, unhurt, tail high, pleased with himself. Thatcher knelt, scratched behind the dog's ears. Good boy. Good work. Ranger leaned into the contact, still alert but satisfied. They'd faced a threat together and come through intact. That was enough. But the spokesman's final words echoed in Thatcher's mind. Sterling will come himself. That made sense. The developer had exhausted his options. Hired help had failed. Legal strategies were crumbling as evidence mounted. Public opinion was turning against him as the story spread. Sterling was cornered. And cornered men with resources and arrogance often made desperate choices, would convince themselves that direct action was justified, that removing the problem personally was the only way to guarantee results. Thatcher spent the rest of the night fortifying his position, moving supplies into the Wanderer, creating cash points with water ammunition in the original documents sealed in waterproof containers. If Sterling came himself, if this turned into a prolonged standoff, Thatcher needed to be able to hold the ship indefinitely, needed to survive long enough for the legal process to run its course, for the truth to become so embedded in public record that killing him would accomplish nothing except adding murder to Sterling's list of crimes. Dawn came gray and cold. The tide was out, leaving the mud flats exposed and treacherous. Thatcher stood on the Wanderer's deck, watching the access road. Waiting, Ranger sat beside him, both of them still, both of them patient. The kind of patience that came from training and experience and understanding that some battles were won by whoever could endure longest. The black sedan appeared at 10 in the morning. Same vehicle Sterling had arrived in weeks ago. It drove slowly down the access road, stopped 50 yards from the Wanderer. The engine idled for a long minute, then shut off. The driver's door opened, and Victor Sterling stepped out alone. No bodyguards, no backup. Just a man in an expensive suit walking across the mud flat toward a ship graveyard like he owned it. Like this was still a negotiation he could win. Thatcher watched him approach, noted the bulge under Sterling's jacket that suggested a concealed weapon, noted the way Sterling's eyes scanned the graveyard, looking for threats, for Thatcher's position, finding neither because Thatcher had chosen concealment over visibility, had learned in Afghanistan that being seen meant being targeted and staying hidden meant controlling the engagement. Sterling stopped at the base of the Wanderer, looked up at the rusted hull. I know you're here, Kane. I can see your dog. We need to talk. Face to face, no more intermediaries, no more threats. Just two men who understand what's at stake and can maybe find a solution that doesn't end with one of us dead. The reasonableness in Sterling's voice was almost convincing, almost made it sound like this could be resolved with words instead of violence. But Thatcher had heard that tone before, from Taliban fighters offering surrender while their friends positioned for ambush, from insurgents claiming to be civilians while reaching for concealed weapons. Reasonableness was often just another weapon, another tool used by people who'd learned that appearing cooperative got them closer to their real objectives. Say what you came to say. Thatcher's voice came from inside the ship, echoing, directionless. Then leave. We don't have anything to negotiate. Sterling's jaw tightened, the mask of civility slipping just slightly. You've made your point. The story's out. My family's reputation is damaged. The investigation is happening whether I like it or not. You've won that battle. But this land, this ship, the evidence you're sitting on, that's still negotiable. I'm prepared to acknowledge that my grandfather committed crimes, prepared to facilitate reparations to the Reeves family, prepared to donate the contested land to veterans' causes. All of it, everything you want, in exchange for the original documents, the journal, the letters, the physical evidence that makes this more than just a story. It was a clever offer, gave Thatcher almost everything he'd been fighting for while asking only for the one thing Sterling needed to prevent complete destruction. Without the original documents, the story became harder to prove, became he said, she said that lawyers could tie up for years. With the documents destroyed, Sterling could rebuild, could spin the narrative, could survive the scandal and emerge diminished but intact. No, Thatcher said. Simple. Final. The documents stay exactly where they are, preserved, protected, available for every prosecutor and journalist and historian who wants to examine them. Your grandfather was a traitor. Your family built their fortune on murder and theft. That truth doesn't get negotiated away. It gets remembered forever. Sterling's composure cracked. The pleasant mask fell away entirely, revealing something uglier underneath. You self-righteous son of a bitch. You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing. A broken soldier living in a trash heap, clinging to dead men's honor because you don't have any of your own. Daniel Reeves died because you screwed up, because you gave the order that got him killed. And now you're trying to redeem yourself by destroying my family. Like that somehow makes you less guilty, less responsible for getting your best friend blown to pieces. The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage, each one true enough to hurt. Thatcher had lived with that guilt for 3 years, had carried it every day, had come to this graveyard to escape it, and Sterling was weaponizing it, using Thatcher's own pain against him. You're right, Thatcher said quietly, his voice steady despite the knives Sterling was twisting. Daniel died because of my call, because I trusted intelligence that was wrong, because I made a mistake and he paid for it. I'll carry that forever. But this isn't about redemption. This is about keeping a promise. Daniel deserves to know his great-grandfather was a hero. Your grandfather deserves to be remembered as a traitor. Those are facts, and they don't change because you threaten me or insult me or try to make this personal. Sterling pulled the weapon from his jacket, not quickly, deliberately, showing Thatcher what he already suspected, that this conversation was heading toward violence regardless of what either of them said. Those documents belong to my family, my grandfather's personal effects, private property that you stole during an illegal trespass. I'm well within my rights to defend my property and my family's reputation. And when the police find your body out here, when they see the evidence of mental instability and paranoid delusions, no jury will question what happened. The disturbed veteran finally went too far. Tragic. Inevitable. Thatcher had been waiting for this moment, had known it was coming since Sterling stepped out of his vehicle. He gave the signal, a low whistle, barely audible barn, but Ranger heard it. The dog had been positioned inside the ship's forward hold, hidden, waiting. Now he moved with the silent precision of a military K-9 executing a train maneuver. Ranger came through the secret passage Captain Hartley had built into the Wanderer's hull structure, the same passage Thatcher had discovered by following the schematics, the same passage that led from the forward hold through a modified bulkhead to an opening behind where Sterling stood. The dog emerged from shadows, low, fast, covering the distance before Sterling registered the movement. Ranger didn't attack. Thatcher had trained him too well for that. The dog simply positioned himself between Sterling and any escape route, teeth bared, a growl vibrating in his chest, the kind of threat that spoke directly to the primitive part of the brain that understood predators. Sterling spun, raised his weapon toward the dog, and froze as Thatcher's voice cut through his decision-making. Pull that trigger, and I'll shoot you where you stand. Thatcher had emerged from his position inside the Wanderer, standing on the deck with the shotgun aimed at center mass. Drop the weapon. Kick it away. Do it now. For a long moment, Sterling didn't move, caught between the dog in front of him and the man behind. Between pride that demanded resistance and survival instinct that recognized losing odds. Finally, he lowered his weapon, let it fall to the mud, kicked it toward the water where it disappeared into a brackish pool with barely a splash. This is over, Thatcher said. The police are already on their way. Wade called them when your men attacked last night. Call them again when you showed up this morning. They'll be here in 5 minutes. Maybe less. You can wait for them standing up or lying face down in the mud. Your choice. Sterling's face had gone pale, the calculation in his eyes shifting, reassessing. You can't prove anything. My lawyer will have me out in hours. This is harassment, false imprisonment. I'll own everything you have by the time litigation is finished. Maybe Thatcher replied, keeping the shotgun steady. But you'll do it from a cell while prosecutors examine every document we recovered. While Margaret Reeves testifies about how your grandfather's theft destroyed her family, while journalists dig into every business deal you've ever made to see what else you've been hiding, your reputation is finished. Your political connections won't return your calls. Your business partners would distance themselves to avoid contamination. The Sterling name will be synonymous with treason and corruption for generations. That's not a threat. That's just reality. You made choices. Now you live with consequences. The sound of sirens carried across the mudflats. Multiple vehicles approaching fast. Sterling looked toward the access road, back at Thatcher, at the D still holding position, at the ship that had refused to keep its secrets buried. Something in his expression crumbled, the arrogance and entitlement giving way to recognition that he'd lost, that no amount of money or influence could change what was coming. The police arrived in force. State police and county sheriff. They had been briefed by Wade in the Attorney General's office, had warrants for Sterling's arrest on charges ranging from criminal trespass to attempted murder based on testimony from the men who'd fled the night before, had authorization to seize Sterling's property and financial records as part of the ongoing fraud investigation. They approached with weapons drawn, but Thatcher had already secured the situation. Had Sterling on his knees with hands visible, had the scene controlled. The lead detective was a woman in her 40s, Sergeant Rachel Brennan. She took in the setup with professional assessment, the defensive positions, the floodlights. The shotgun Thatcher was now lowering to safe position. Mr. Kane, you want to tell me what happened here? Thatcher gave a statement, factual, concise, no embellishment. The attacks on his property, Sterling's threats, the attempt to bribe and then eliminate him. Wade had provided corroborating evidence, security footage from his store showing Sterling's men, cell phone records showing calls between Sterling and the men who'd fled. Enough to make the charges stick even without Thatcher's testimony. Sterling was handcuffed, read his rights, led away to a police vehicle while news cameras that had followed the raid captured every moment. The developer who'd threatened and bribed and attacked his way through decades of business dealings finally being held accountable. The footage would be on every network by evening. The symbol of justice delayed but not denied. Sergeant Brennan stayed after the other officers left, walked the graveyard with Thatcher, examined the Wanderer, listened as he explained about the journal and the letters and the 80-year-old crimes that had led to this confrontation. She was thorough, skeptical in the way good investigators should be. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documentation was pristine. And by the time she finished her examination, she was nodding. "This goes beyond my jurisdiction," she said. "But I'll make sure the federal prosecutors get everything they need. What your great-uncle preserved, what you recovered. It's enough to rewrite history, to give closure to families who deserved it decades ago. That matters." She left with copies of the documents, promises to stay in touch, assurances that Thatcher would be protected if Sterling's associates tried retaliation. The sun was setting by the time the graveyard was quiet again. Just Thatcher and Ranger and the ships that had witnessed everything. The dog was exhausted, lay down in the mud near the Wanderer's Hall, and refused to move. Thatcher sat beside him, scratched behind his ears, let the adrenaline drain away and the reality settle in. It was done. The fight was finished. Sterling would face trial. Margaret Reeves would get restitution. Daniel's mother would see her son's great-grandfather honored. The truth was out, public, permanent. Everything Thatcher had promised himself he'd accomplish. Everything he'd been willing to die protecting, all of it secured. He should have felt victorious, should have felt the satisfaction of mission accomplished. But what he felt was emptier, quieter, like waking from a dream and not remembering why you'd been running. The ghosts were still there. Daniel, Thomas Reeves, Captain Hartley, all the men who died believing honor mattered. But they were quieter now, less accusatory, more like companions and judges. Thatcher pulled out this silver compass, the one he'd found among Thomas Reeves' effects. Had been carrying it for weeks without really examining it. Now he held it up to the fading light, studied the engraving on the back. Coordinates. Numbers that meant nothing to casual observation, but might mean everything to someone who knew where to look. He entered them into his phone, cross-referenced with nautical charts. The coordinates pointed to a location 200 miles offshore. Deep water, no registered wrecks in the area, no obvious significance. But Captain Hartley's final journal entry had mentioned treasure, had implied the gold from the German U-boat hadn't been recovered, that it had been scuttled somewhere the Navy couldn't find it, somewhere that only the men who'd hidden it would ever know. This was it, the location of actual treasure worth millions, maybe tens of millions. Enough money to change everything, to fund the maritime retreat Thatcher had been planning, to provide for veterans who needed it, to give Margaret Reeves more than just restitution, to make the suffering worth something material instead of just symbolic. Thatcher stood, looked out at the ocean, at the horizon where water met sky in shades of gray and purple. He could pursue it, could rent equipment and dive the coordinates and recover whatever was down there. Captain Hartley had left the breadcrumbs, had trusted that whoever found them would use the treasure wisely, would honor the sacrifice it represented. But Thatcher had learned something in the past weeks, something about what mattered and what didn't. The treasure wasn't the point, had never been the point. Thomas Reeves hadn't died protecting gold. He died protecting truth, honor, the idea that some things were worth more than survival. And Captain Hartley hadn't hidden evidence to make someone rich. He'd hidden it to make someone remember, to ensure that good men who'd paid the ultimate price weren't erased by people who valued convenience over justice. The treasure could stay where it was, 200 miles offshore in water too deep for casual recovery, a monument to men who'd chosen principle over profit, a reminder that not everything valuable needed to be possessed. Sometimes the greatest treasure was knowing it existed and choosing to leave it untouched. Thatcher pocketed the compass, made his decision. The coordinates would go into the documents he was preserving, would be recorded for history but not pursued for gain. Let some future generation discover it, or let it stay hidden forever. Either way, it had served its purpose, had been the bait that brought Sterling out of hiding, had been the final piece of proof that the crimes were real and the cover-up was thorough, and the men who'd fought against it deserved to be remembered. The legal proceedings took months. Sterling's trial was public and thorough. Federal prosecutors had found decades of additional fraud, tax evasion, bribery, construction violations, money laundering. The wartime treason was just the beginning. The Sterling Empire collapsed under scrutiny. Properties were seized, assets frozen, partners indicted. By the time sentencing came, Victor Sterling was a broken man facing 20 years in federal prison. Margaret Reeves received the land deed in a quiet ceremony attended by veterans groups and local officials. She donated half to a trust that would establish the Daniel Reeves Maritime Sanctuary. The other half she kept, sold to a conservation group for enough money to ensure she'd never spend another night in a shelter. She cried when the check was presented. Not from happiness, from the weight of it all, from understanding that her father's honor had finally been acknowledged, but at a cost that had echoed through 3 generations. Thatcher used the condemned ships in the graveyard as the foundation for the sanctuary, restored them one by one with help from Wade and volunteers from across the state. Veterans came to work with their hands, to scrape rust and weld steel and rebuild things that had been broken, to find purpose in preservation, to discover that healing didn't come from forgetting, but from doing, from building something that mattered. The Wanderer was finished first, fully restored to her 1944 configuration based on the schematics Captain Hartley had left behind. She became the centerpiece of the sanctuary, a museum and memorial, a place where people could walk her decks and read her history and understand what men like Thomas Reeves and James Hartley had fought for. The journal was displayed in a climate-controlled case, available for any visitor to read, to understand, to remember. Daniel's mother came to the dedication ceremony, stood on the Wanderer's deck with tears streaming down her face as Thatcher explained how her son's great-grandfather had died, how the legacy Daniel had been so proud of was real, was true, was worth every sacrifice it had demanded. She hugged Thatcher afterward, held him while he finally let himself cry for the friend he'd lost, for the guilt he'd carried, for the promise he'd kept even when keeping it had costed everything. "He would be proud of you," she whispered. "Daniel would be so proud." Thatcher didn't know if that was true, but he knew he'd done what he could, had honored his friend the only way he knew how, by standing for something, by refusing to let truth be buried, by keeping promises even when the cost seemed unbearable. That had to be enough, had to matter. The sanctuary grew, more ships restored, more veterans arriving to help, a community forming around the idea that broken things could be rebuilt if you were patient enough, if you were willing to do the work. Wade became the operations director, managed volunteers and coordinated projects, and made sure the mission stayed true. Margaret visited often, brought flowers to place on the memorial plaque bearing her father's name, sat in the restored captain's quarters where Thomas Reeves' letter to his wife was displayed, and talked to him like he could hear her. Thatcher lived in a small house now, built on the property with his own hands. Not the trailer, something permanent, something that suggested he was staying. Ranger had gotten older, moved slower, but still patrolled the grounds every morning, still alerted to threats that no longer came, still pressed his weight against Thatcher's leg when the nightmares got bad and the ghosts got loud. On quiet evenings, Thatcher would walk to the Wanderer, stand on her deck and look out at the ocean, at the horizon that held secrets and treasure and the coordinates he'd never pursue. The compass stayed in his pocket, a reminder that some things were valuable precisely because they remained out of reach, that not everything needed to be conquered or possessed or monetized, that sometimes the greatest victory was knowing when to stop fighting and let peace settle in the spaces where war had been. The journalist had asked him once if he felt vindicated, if seeing Sterling convicted and the truth exposed had given him closure. Thatcher had thought about it before answering, thought about Daniel and Thomas and Captain Hartley, about all the men who'd believed honor mattered when evidence suggested otherwise, about the 3 years he'd spent running from guilt, only to discover that redemption came from running towards something instead. "I feel like I kept a promise," he'd said finally. "That's enough." And it was. The ghosts were quieter now. Not gone, they'd never be gone, but transformed from accusations into companions, from burdens into purpose. Daniel's photograph still hung on the wall, but Thatcher could look at it now without flinching, could remember the grin and the friendship and the sacrifice without drowning in the guilt of survival. The Maritime Sanctuary became known across New England. Veterans traveled from 6 states to participate, to work with their hands, to rebuild ships in themselves simultaneously, to discover that trauma could be processed through labor, that grief could be channeled into creation, that brotherhood didn't end when the uniform came off. The waiting list grew. The funding came from grants and donations and people who believed in second chances. Wade turned 70 and showed no signs of slowing. He'd found purpose too, in helping younger veterans navigate the same darkness he'd walked through decades earlier, in being the mentor and father figure and battle buddy that made survival possible when everything else suggested giving up. He and Thatcher didn't talk much about the battle with Sterling, didn't need to. They'd stood together when it mattered, had proven that some fights were worth having even when the odds looked impossible. That was enough. Margaret came to live in Port Hollow, bought a small house near the sanctuary, volunteered as a docent giving tours of the Wanderer and telling her father's story to visitors who came to understand what had happened here. She'd found peace too, in seeing Thomas Reeves honored, in knowing that the decades of poverty and struggle hadn't been for nothing. That truth had surfaced even when powerful people had tried to bury it. She and Thatcher became friends, not family exactly, but something close, connected by loss and legacy, and the understanding that justice delayed wasn't justice denied if someone was willing to fight for it. The compass stayed in Thatcher's pocket. He'd pull it out sometimes, study the coordinates, wonder what was down there in the deep water. Gold, art, history, proof of things that had been lost. But he never pursued it, never even seriously considered it, because he'd learned what Captain Hartley had known, that the real treasure wasn't the cargo, it was the principle. The choice to value truth over profit, honor over survival, legacy over wealth. On the 5-year anniversary of Daniel's death, Thatcher stood on the Wanderer's deck at dawn. Ranger was gone now. The dog had passed quietly in his sleep 6 months earlier. Old age and a life well lived. Thatcher had buried him near the ship, placed a marker that read, Ranger, loyal, true, found what needed finding. The kind of simple epitaph that said everything important. The sun rose over the ocean, painting the ships in shades of gold and rust. The sanctuary was quiet this early, just Thatcher and the ghosts and the knowledge that he'd done what he could, had kept his promises, had honored men who deserved honoring. The guilt wasn't gone, would never be gone, but it had transformed into something bearable, something that drove him forward instead of holding him back. Daniel's voice in his head was different now, not accusing, almost proud, almost satisfied, like his friend understood that Thatcher had taken the worst moment of both their lives and turned it into something meaningful, had made the sacrifice matter, had proven that one man standing for truth could change the trajectory of history if he was stubborn enough, brave enough, stupid enough to care when caring was dangerous. Thatcher pulled out the compass one final time, held it up to catch the morning light. The coordinates glinted, permanent, preserved, a secret that would remain secret because some things were more valuable undiscovered. He closed his fist around the metal, felt its weight, its history, its promise of treasure that would never be claimed. Then he put it back in his pocket and walked down to the workshop where 3 new veterans were arriving today, young men from recent conflicts, carrying fresh wounds and old questions, looking for the same thing Thatcher had been looking for when he'd arrived at this graveyard years ago. Purpose, peace, a reason to keep going when everything suggested stopping. He would help them find it, would teach them what Wade had taught him, what the Wanderer had shown him, that healing came from building, that redemption came from honoring, that brotherhood meant standing together even when standing alone seemed easier. The cycle would continue, the sanctuary would grow, and somewhere in the deep water, 200 miles offshore, treasure would rest undisturbed, a monument to men who'd valued something more than gold. Thatcher Kane had come to the ship graveyard to disappear, to rust away alongside forgotten vessels. Instead, he'd found a mission that mattered, had discovered that the things worth fighting for were never the things you could hold in your hands. They were the promises you kept, the truths you defended, the legacies you honored when honoring them cost everything. The ship stood silent in the morning light, restored, preserved, transformed from monuments to decay into symbols of resurrection. And Thatcher stood among them, no longer running, no longer drowning, just present, just purposeful. Just a man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest treasure was choosing to leave treasure unfound. That sometimes winning meant knowing what to fight for and what to let go. That sometimes peace came not from forgetting the past, but from building something in the present that honored it. The work continued, the sanctuary grew, and the wanderer kept her secrets while sharing her story. A ship that had refused to stay buried, teaching lessons about honor and sacrifice and the kind of courage that echoes across generations. Teaching that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. That some truths demand to be told even when silence is safer. That some men, when everything is stripped away, discover they were always meant to stand for something larger than survival. Thatcher walked toward the workshop, toward the young veterans waiting for direction, toward the work that would fill his days and quiet his nights. Behind him, the sun climbed higher. The tide began to turn, and the compass in his pocket held coordinates that would never be pursued because the real treasure had already been found. Not in gold or art or artifacts, but in purpose, in legacy, in the knowledge that one man standing for truth could make a difference that rippled forward through time. The ghost walked with him now, not haunting, accompanying, Daniel and Thomas and Captain Hartley and all the men who'd believed honor mattered. They were quiet, satisfied, released from the burden of being forgotten, their stories told, their sacrifices acknowledged, their legacy preserved in steel and wood, and the lives of veterans who came to this graveyard looking for salvation and found instead the harder gift of purpose. Thatcher Kane had kept his promises, had honored the dead by serving the living, had transformed pain into meaning and loss into legacy, and in doing so had discovered the truth that Captain Hartley had tried to leave behind. That treasure isn't what you find, it's what you build, what you protect, what you're willing to stand for when standing costs everything. That was the real inheritance, the real gift, the real mission. And Thatcher would spend the rest of his life proving it mattered.